Everyone needs compassion, a love that's never failing. Let mercy fall on me. Everyone needs forgiveness, the kindness of a Savior, the hope of nations. Savior, He can move the mountains. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save forever. Author of salvation, He rose and conquered the grave. Jesus conquered the grave. So take me as you find me, all my fears and failures. Fill my life again. I give my life to follow everything I believe in. Now I surrender. Savior, He can move the mountains. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save forever. Author of salvation, He rose and conquered the grave. Jesus conquered the grave. Shine your light and let the whole world see. We're singing for the glory of the risen King. Jesus, shine your light and let the whole world see. We're singing for the glory of the risen King. Savior, He can move the mountains. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save forever. Author of salvation, He rose and conquered the grave. Jesus conquered the grave.
Welcome to Light in the Darkness. A few weeks ago, I was meeting with a team from Oliver Creek members called the Recovery Coalition. These are people who are focused on recovery and mental health, often in their field, but also in our ministries. And one of the questions we were asking is, how is coronavirus, how is isolation, quarantine, how is separation from other people, and all the transition and change and challenges that people are facing, how's it going to affect our people? Who are the most vulnerable? What are they facing? And as we named a dozen critical people and groups of people, we realized that we needed to do something to equip our family at Oliver Creek for navigating these challenging times. There's so much darkness right now. And I think in the darkness is actually the best time to shine the light of Jesus, because it's so much more visible. But it's also the most difficult time to shine the light of Jesus, because we ourselves are part of that darkness. We're experiencing it too. This series, Light in the Darkness, is going to release for the couple of weeks that we're in quarantine on Fridays. And what I want to do is to share some of the specific topics and challenges that we're facing, the darkness that we're living in, and try to walk through it. So I'm going to bring on members of the Recovery Coalition, and I'm going to interview them, and they're going to help us get practices and habits for what we're facing at this strange time during the coronavirus epidemic and quarantine in our homes. And I think one of the most common pressures that we're all facing, one of the most common areas of darkness that we're all living in, is anxiety. Anxiety. It's everywhere. It's like its own virus, its own contagion. And in fact, I think one of the major problems with anxiety is that it spreads like a virus. It's shared from person to person to person. And so if dad comes home from work anxious and frustrated because of a conversation, he then takes it out on his children, and his children then let it out at home in a different way. It is the system and cycle of anxiety that's shared. And right now, we are not only concerned about catching the coronavirus, we're also concerned about the reality of catching this anxiety that's all over the place. Paul says in Philippians chapter 4, he says, don't be anxious about anything. Instead, in everything, pray with thanksgiving. Don't be anxious about anything? This is a real struggle for me right now. In fact, one of these areas of leadership that I'm trying to focus on right now is on managing my own anxiety. I keep telling our elders and our ministers when we get together that the most important thing that we can do right now may be simply managing our own anxiety. A couple of weeks before the quarantine, one of the last things I did was go to a conference where an author was presenting, and the whole conference was about managing leadership anxiety. I think this is a real issue any day of the week. I had planned to do a whole quarter on anxiety when I got back. But now I think it's more acute. It's more pressing that we deal with this problem. Don't be anxious about anything. This is a challenge for me, and it's not just me. This week I've been on the phone with a lot of Oliver Creek members, and I've been checking in, asking for prayer requests. And the most common word I think that came up in our prayer requests was anxiety. Somebody said that anxiety is just a thing that we're all dealing with right now. And it looks a lot of different ways. It looks like somebody concerned about their grandchild on a naval carrier that has coronavirus. It looks like somebody concerned about going into work at the emergency room. It looks like cut hours and lost wages. It looks like mom and dad losing their temper on the children as they're trying to navigate homework and work all at the same table in the same house. There's so many changes, so many challenges right now that are producing anxiety. And anxiety may be the thing underneath a lot of the other topics that we'll talk about in coming weeks. It's worth talking about anxiety. So here's what you can expect. I'm going to share a few minutes about why this is a problem right now. And then the majority of our time together will be actually me interviewing one of the members of our Recovery Coalition. Today, it's Landon Self, who's a licensed counselor who's walked through and helped many, many people deal with anxiety. I think one of the reasons that anxiety is a problem is because not only does it spread from person to person, but then it creates conflict in its wake. And so a lot of folks are experiencing anxiety, and it shows up as an outburst of anger. It shows up as impatience. For some, it shows up you plow forward, and for others, it looks like you're pulling back because you're worried. It looks like you have a spinning mind, but you see it creates conflict because an anxious person isn't capable of controlling and managing their own emotions, and so often they mistreat the people who are closest to them. And those people are also anxious, and it just creates these environments where we're anticipating, just like it's happening across your families, we're anticipating some anxiety. That's normal, but we want to give you some tips for how to walk through that. Another reason this may be a problem is because it leads to exhaustion and burnout. Anxiety, it's like a gospel. It says, you can get through this, here's how. And the answer that anxiety gives always depends on you. Anxiety, that's the false gospel. The author I was talking about, his name's Steve Cuss. The other day he said this. He says, one way you know you're in anxiety's grip is you forget God's presence. Anxiety has a gospel, but it's always bad news because you feel like it all is on you. One of Cuss's big theories is that our awareness of God's presence and our awareness of our anxiety, they operate in the same space. So that means that you cannot feel the presence of God, you cannot experience the joy of the Lord and your own anxiety. You have to attend to one or to the other. Anxiety displaces God in our lives. Not just God though, it displaces other people. He says you cannot be tending to your own anxiety and to the people in the room with you. we've got to manage our own anxiety in order to avoid these conflicts, in order to get over this exhaustion like it all depends on us. Because anxiety depends on a false gospel. And we believe in the true gospel of Jesus Christ. But the truth is that that is a false gospel. And the true gospel that we have to remind ourselves of, the light that we're actually trying to shine, is that Jesus Christ and His grace is sufficient. Instead of the false gospel that it all relies on me, we realize that it's already been accomplished in Him. And these things that I think all depend on me, actually, He's far more involved, far more present than I realize. But the truth is that God is actually with you. And the truth is that God's actually already ahead of you. And so the days ahead that we're so concerned about, God's going to be there too. So when we dwell upon the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ, we come to realize that it doesn't all depend on me or you, and the things that we think we need may have actually been provided in so many ways. That there's so much peace and security and hope in this true gospel of Christ. How do we do this? In just a moment, I'm going to share an interview with Landon Self. But what we'll find is that anxiety, the solution to it is never more. It's not try harder. Anxiety needs to be dissolved and displaced. It needs to be replaced with something else. If your answer is try harder, that's the sure way to make anxiety chronic. That's not the solution. But the solution is to apply the gospel of Jesus Christ to the rhythms of grace and to the life of spiritual fellowship. So, I hope you'll join us for the rest of this interview. My friend Landon Self will join me, and we'll walk through habits and practices that you can put into place anytime, but especially during this strange time that we're living in such darkness. Thanks for joining us for Light in the Darkness. Hey everyone, I'd like to welcome you to part 2 of Light in the Darkness. And we're bringing a special guest, a friend of mine named Landon Self. Landon is a member at the Oliver Creek Church of Christ. He's a licensed professional counselor, and he has many years' experience in the hospital setting and in private practice. Landon, thank you for joining us and for bringing all your expertise.
Glad to be here.
Landon's going to help me kind of walk through what to do about the anxiety that many of us are feeling right now. And he's got some kind of general practices and some specific to kind of the art of living during quarantine. So, Landon, let's get going. First of all, like big picture, how are you thinking about managing anxiety? If you're dealing with a whole person, how should we think of ourselves?
Well, I think of us as being in 4 components, thinking about the spiritual aspect, the physical, emotional, and mental. Sometimes we tend to notice anxiety in one of those aspects, but it's usually bleeding over into all 4 and having an effect. So if we can have an awareness of what we're experiencing the anxiety as in that moment and start to manage it, then it's probably going to help us to manage the others. So if I'm really in my head with anxious thoughts, then as I manage those, it's going to help the emotions or the physical sensations that I'll probably also noticing, just not quite as aware of in that moment.
Yeah, so they're all wrapped together, but these are different pieces that you can kind of tackle independently.
Right.
Okay. Well, which one do you want to dive into first?
Let's just go with spiritual first.
Okay. Well, one of the guys I've been reading and our staff has been reading is a man named Steve Cuss, who's written a book on anxiety. And actually, right before quarantine and shutdown, I was at a conference called Managing Leadership Anxiety. And one of his big points is that the presence of God and anxiety are operating in the same mind space. So he's saying his central claim is that you cannot be present to your own anxiety and be fully present to God or aware of God's presence with you. You cannot be fully present with both your anxiety and another person at the same time. You just get lost in your own headspace.
Yeah.
So how can we walk through this spiritual component of managing our own anxiety?
Okay. So I think a part of it is that whenever we start to get anxious, we do immediately start to get distracted from that core connection that we have with God, because I may feel firm and confident and comfortable with God the entire day, and then that anxious moment hits, and suddenly I start to lose that. And so, if I'm spending time with God in prayer, in Bible reading, and I'm feeling more confident in that connection, then any of those moments when anxiety starts to rise, there's already going to be this kind of spiritual foundation that's going to help notice that disconnect, probably.
Yeah.
And then in noticing that, being able to then start to pause and figure out what the next step is.
Yes.
So I think anxiety ends up being much more manageable when we're already feeding and nourishing ourselves spiritually.
So what are some ways we can nourish spiritually?
Okay. So when we wake up in the morning, as easy as it is to get busy and going with the day, if we could spend just a few minutes in prayer and Bible reading, with whatever that looks like, whether that's 5, 10, 15 minutes, that's really going to allow us to center. Lately, I've been in the Psalms, and so I've been spending some time with the Psalms, and some of them have been pretty good and encouraging. Some of them have been a bit more lamentish, and that is okay, because right now, in an uncertain time, it's good to be able to get a reflection of that. But even in those Psalms that do have lament, it usually works its way back to God as a good God who loves us and cares for us. And so there's sometimes some questioning, which anxiety gets us to do. But at the same time, there's this foundation of God, you are holy and you are awesome and you're watching over me.
Yeah.
Uh,
I shared one of mine on Sunday in our sermon.
mhm.
It's the Jesus prayer is kind of a centering prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, a sinner. And
Yeah,
I think there's a lot of centering prayers that kind of reorient you to the presence of God in your life. So if anxiety and God, our awareness of God's presence are operating in the same space, then just heightening our awareness and inviting God's presence back into our lives is one way to dissolve it. Um,
yes.
you mentioned the Psalms. I assume there's some reading, probably some reflection, probably some prayer.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So being able to reflect on that, and then, so how does this apply to me today? What's this going to look like for the day that I have ahead of me, knowing that if I've got this work or I've got some of these interactions, how can I carry what I just read about, or notice how God was able to be present to offer comfort for them in that moment? What's that going to look like for me, so that I carry that with me? And then that affects how I pray in preparation for the day, about thinking of his presence with me, in me, whether it's working with clients or even doing something like this, and how his guidance is going to allow um, much good to come.
Yeah, so it seems like we've talked about it from a preparation standpoint. Like you can begin and end your day in reflection on the amazing Word of God.
Yeah.
But then in those moments, whenever you're feeling anxiety, you just mentioned
Mhm.
kind of slowing down and becoming aware of the presence of God. I think both of those are really good tools to keep in your bag to manage anxiety.
Definitely.
So, anything else you want to share with us on the spiritual side about managing walking through anxiety?
I think being able to realize that God knows he created us to be able to experience anxiety.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, anxiety is normal, and yet when we feel it, that's when we're supposed to turn to God. Like, that's when he wants to comfort us. Anytime we're feeling discomfort, we're feeling upset, we're feeling anxious, like, we have a heavenly Father who says, hey, I'm here. Let me put my arm around you. Let me hold you in this moment. And so anytime we're doing any of those spiritual disciplines, it's like we're inviting ourselves to take that moment with him,
Yeah.
because he's already there ready to do it. We just have to pause and let it happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I like 1 Peter 5:7, where he says, cast your cares on him because he cares for you. So
Mm-hmm.
when you feel anxiety, some of us that makes us more anxious, some of us that makes us feel guilty. But actually, I think you're saying that it should be a trigger to reflect on the mercy of God. Like
Yeah,
when you feel this, that's when you know, oh, he's here, he cares about me. That's where I actually need to lean in. Um,
right.
I think it's
Yes.
important that you also mentioned that this isn't something that anybody masters. That this is a normal part of life and in a fallen world as we've been created out of dust. You're going to feel anxiety. What you do with that anxiety is up to you. Um, so,
Right.
anything else on that?
No, let's move on.
Okay. Um, can we go into the physiological side um,
Oh, yeah.
of anxiety? So, what are some practices that could help us manage anxiety?
So, with the physical, physiological aspect, when we start to notice anxiety, a lot of times there'll be a little bit of shaking. I notice that with myself, that I can tell when my hands are starting to get shaky or a little sweaty, the increased heart rate. Even my breath will start to get shallow, and I may not notice it being quicker. And so we have this physiological response that says, if I'm experiencing anxiety, I need to be ready to act. And if I don't know how to act, I may just start to freeze up, even though my body is experiencing all of these different things to try to figure out what to do next.
That's where we've heard fight or flight or freeze, right?
That's right. Yeah. We either go into the fight or flight mode. I need to fight to protect myself, flee, get away, or I don't know what to do. So I'm just going to freeze up and be deer in the headlights kind of look.
Yeah.
And so with that, then it always starts with our breathing. And if I can start to catch my breath and slow it down, even if I'm not doing it real well, the more I'm able to make the breath slow and deep, the more it's encouraging my automatic nervous system to start to come out of that fight and flight and freeze state, to be able to move back towards a calm state. Because that's something that's beyond our control. We don't control our nervous system, but when I slow down my breath, I'm communicating directly to the nervous system, hey, maybe we don't have to be so on edge right now.
Yeah.
So let's start taking a step back.
So you can bodily communicate, as it were, to your nervous system and your automatic functions.
Yes. Yeah.
I
And
think
doing
later
that with
on
your
we'll
breath.
talk about verbally and cognitively communicating with our bodies. But you're saying even
Hmm.
our bodies themselves can trigger things in our minds. So
Right.
slowing down and breathing is one way to do that. Now,
Yes, that ends up being the foundation for anything else that you're going to do, because it's real hard to redirect emotions or thoughts if our body's still physiologically responding. So if we can get it to calm down with that breath, then we can start giving attention to these other things we'll talk about in a minute.
yeah. So I heard somebody say, "How do you know when you're anxious?" And they said, "Well, it's when I take a deep breath." I'm like, "Well, you know you're anxious, so you took the deep breath." That's we're trying to slow down and center ourselves and breathe. I think it's interesting though how breathing and spiritual practices can also go together.
Yeah.
Can you speak to the connection of physical and spiritual for just a second?
So whenever we take that slow, deep breath, it allows us to pause, and it's a breath that God gave us. You know, He breathed into Adam's nostrils, right, and gave him that breath. And so it's the same with us, that when we slow down, it's almost like inviting God to come in and be in that space. Because when I practice breathing with clients, we usually will breathe in for about 6 or so seconds, hold it for a few seconds, and then release it for about 6 to 8 seconds,
Yeah.
which means that's a pretty long breath,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Very
We
deep breath.
typically, and so when we're slowing down our breathing to that space, it's almost pushing us to be still. And in that stillness, a lot of time is when God's presence starts to be felt and to show up.
One thing we do with our kids, we just call it a 4 count.
Hmm.
They have to take a deep breath, hold it for 4 seconds, then slowly breathe it out. So
Yeah.
whenever we start seeing them get agitated or anxious, do a 4 count, and it's kind of a way to slow down. Kelsey and I do the same thing ourselves. I mentioned on Sunday also that centering prayer. That's a good opportunity. As you breathe in, you say part of the prayer. as you breathe out, you can say the rest of the prayer. So, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, a sinner. And you can combine the physical and the spiritual, of course, in many ways.
Yeah.
You talked about um, like a shortness of breath, a tightening gut. What's happening with your heart physically?
Well, it is speeding up. It's starting to beat faster and often heavier, where you can like feel the thuds of your heart, and that's trying to get the blood flow going. And yet, when our breathing is quicker and shallow, we're not getting in as much oxygen, and that's when people start to move towards like hyperventilating. And so, when we slow the breath down, it helps the heart to start to actually get more oxygen into the brain, into the bloodstream, and then the heart will eventually start to decrease because it realizes like, oh no, we're good.
Yeah. So your heart and your lungs start functioning differently. But what about hormones? What's going on with your body's hormones as you're
Yeah.
experiencing anxiety?
So it's releasing cortisol, the stress hormone, and whenever cortisol is floating around, it starts to get us to where it's almost like attaching to the specific memories, to the specific instances, to where we then can continue to feel stress whenever there's reminders or that kind of thing. And so we want to be real careful about trying to help our body know, like, hey, you don't have to release the cortisol right now. In fact, if we can do this to help it decrease the release of cortisol, that will start to spread thin, and as that happens, then we'll start to feel a bit more calm and relaxed as well.
Yeah. One of my mentors at HST sent a note this week, and there was a line in it that stood out to me. It's that anxiety isn't something that just goes away. It doesn't go away by thinking about it more or by trying harder. Instead, it's either dissolved or displaced. And I think physiologically that's true. Even the cortisol itself needs to be dissolved or displaced. And so it seems like exercise, especially after you felt anxious, can be a
Hmm.
key in dissolving some of what's going on in your body. Can you talk about the importance of
Yeah.
physical exertion?
So a lot of times when we are experiencing anxiety and we have this increase in cortisol and all this stuff's going on, it makes it to where if we can exert that energy that's being created with the anxiety, it does displace. It can push it out, because sometimes when we start to get anxious and we sit with it, it's just like it builds and it builds and it builds. So then we find a way of not necessarily having to overexert ourselves, like just going for a walk
Mhm.
could be a simple way that it's not necessarily strenuous, but it's still using energy and getting your body to have this kind of back and forth movement.
Yeah.
And there have been more and more studies that show that a back and forth, like kind of left and right movement, actually helps the way our body and brain is processing information and emotions and memories. And so a lot of times, like if I'm sitting on the couch and I just sit there with anxiety or my sadness or anger or whatever, it's almost like I'm stuck with it. But a lot of times when we go for a walk or we go running or some sort of physical activity,
Mhm.
we're actually processing through those emotions and whatever's with it. And it helps us to then decrease that anxiety and tension. Oftentimes we'll start to feel a little differently or even have a different kind of thought process after the physical activity.
Yeah. You mentioned feel differently. I'm sure that's true physically, but let's move into the emotional side of walking through anxiety. And are there any emotional practices that could help us?
I think there's this awareness that where we notice like the physical sensations, we often will be uh, will aware that there's also some emotion to it. Like sometimes I'll ask people, well, how are you feeling? Well, I'm feeling sad. And where are you feeling that in your body?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm feeling anxious. Okay, and where are you feeling that? And we already talked about like maybe this tightness in the gut or in the chest or kind of like in the shoulders or
Shoulders
whatever
or
that
back.
may be. And so then with the emotional piece of anxiety, sometimes it's like a fluttering that we may feel within us, and we don't really know what to do with it other than noticing that it's there. And that's why another aspect about the physical activity is that it may say, let me try to work some of this out, or let me just sit and breathe with it, making a still space for God to come in and enjoy that presence of Him, which with emotions, sometimes they describe it as being like a wave of the ocean. And sometimes the waves of the ocean can get really high and scary. But all waves eventually will decrease and dissipate. And so, even as that emotion of anxiety may start to show up and rise, if we can use these skills and these practices to help just let the moment be. A lot of times when people are experiencing high anxiety in particular, it's how can I get rid of it? What can I do to make this go away? And the more I try to push against anxiety or any emotion, the more it has a tendency to push back. And so it's more about, can I respect that this is an emotion, that emotions are strong, that they're powerful, but they also tend to be rather fickle and not stay around. So even though I'm feeling it intensely right now, this emotion is going to come and it's going to go, and I'll get to carry on in 5, 10, 15 minutes, however long it takes for that wave to be ridden out. But I really have to be able to acknowledge it, acknowledge that there is the anxiety. The couple of weeks ago, I was talking with a friend, and we both acknowledged how we had been experiencing kind of this underlying anxiety. So I hadn't really felt it in my body, but only in these certain moments did I notice, like, I feel discomforted. And there wasn't a whole lot that was on my mind, but I just knew that some of this was starting to get to me. And so being able to be aware of that, pray about it, or reach out to others to say, hey, I'm kind of feeling this way. Do you mind offering some prayer for me to help me ride out that wave in essence?
Yeah, I've seen a few authors. I think Dan Siegel in his book Mindset is one. He says, name it to tame it. So
Yes.
sometimes it seems like our emotions are mastering us, but just recognizing and being able to name the emotions that we're feeling has power to kind of get us on top, so that you're still experiencing the emotion, but now you have some power over it because you can recognize it. You called it awareness earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, especially during something like coronavirus quarantine, that we're experiencing all kinds of things and feeling all kinds of things. And some of us, we only feel those as they're coming out. But I think what I'm saying is that the key is to ask, why are they arising within me? Not, oh, I had an outburst of anger. That's anger. But it
Yeah.
really may be coming from a feeling of isolation, a feeling of loneliness, a feeling of powerlessness, that I didn't choose this, I can't do anything about it. So it seems, all right, go on with that. You seem to
Yeah. Yeah.
have the,
So with that, it's almost like whenever we experience one emotion, it's not the only emotion present. So if I'm anxious, I might be anxious because there's, well, like this fear of lack of control. It might be that there's this sadness. I'm not getting to see people. I'm not getting to do things that I used to do. Maybe it's anger because I think someone's not taking this as seriously as they should. And so a lot of times there might be anger, sadness, fear, and anxiety comes up and can be attached to any of those things. And so usually there are a multifaceted amount of emotions present, and being able to pause to recognize that, okay, yeah, I'm anxious. And then, like you pointed out, what else is there? Is it a powerlessness? Is
yeah,
it that just what I was used to, this expectation of life is going to look a certain way, and now it looks really different? And we're all creatures of habit. Some people like their routines more than others, but we still have this general, this is what life is going to look like, this is what life's going to feel like. So
yeah,
then when you have all that changed and changed pretty quickly, then it gets to where you are going to feel a lot of things, and the anger, the anxiety, any of that's going to pop up and start to come out. So if we can practice just some awareness that this is going to feel different, it's going to feel uncomfortable at times, and whatever emotion I start to notice that comes with that, then with that awareness, I can usually start catching it at least in the moment, if not ahead of time. And that will hopefully help me keep from doing something I'm going to have to apologize for later.
Yeah, yeah. So it seems like we've almost already moved from the emotional side of us into the mental side,
Yeah.
because we've started engaging our emotions with questions and words and
Hmm.
reflection. We're trying to name it to tame it. So, is there anything else you want to include on the mental side of managing anxiety?
Why, yes, there are some things that I want to talk about with the mental side. And part of that is being able to recognize our thoughts and then start to redirect those thoughts. So, similar to like riding out the wave of the emotion, when it comes to thoughts, what sometimes counselors have talked about in the past is thought stopping. And like I've done that before where like I'll imagine a stop sign when I'm having this thought that I really don't like. And I'm like, nope, stop, let's go a different direction. But another analogy that I use is that it's like a car coming down the road. I'm standing in the grass in a yard and I see a car coming down the road, then it would pass by and then go on its way, right? And that's kind of like with our thoughts. And if I go out in the road and try to stop that car, how's that going to go for me? I'm not going to do that. And it's kind of the same thing with our thoughts is that even if I'm having a real worrisome, anxious, negative thought, it's not so much about trying to make myself stop having the thought as much as it is going, oh, wow, that's a really anxious, negative, worrisome thought. I don't really want to put my time and energy into that, though. So I'm going to stand in the yard and let the car pass by, go on its way. And I'm going to let the same thing happen with the thought. And some people even get caught up in like, but why would I have that kind of thought? Because we do. And we have a lot of random thoughts just pop up in our mind. And so our thoughts are important, but sometimes they're just random neurons firing that say, hey, let's think about this. And we go, oh, yeah, wow, that's horrifying, though. Let's not spend a lot of time there. So let's just let that pass by. And I'm going to choose to focus on a different thought or a different sensation or something else in my environment around me that I can give attention to.
Yeah. So it seems that in anxious times, finding anxious voices is pretty easy.
Hmm.
So, what would be a healthy way to engage with our minds healthy ideas rather than anxious ideas?
Hmm. So, with that, I think that goes back to where the more we've spent time with the spiritual practices, the better the thoughts are going to come with where I can direct that. Like, is this something that I can turn over to God? Do I have a prayer that I can use as a mantra to go back to? So sometimes what I'll practice with clients is we'll do some breathing exercises, some calming exercises, and then we'll pair a word or a phrase with that image or that feeling that they've gotten to come up that's helping them to feel more calm and relaxed, so that as they take that breath they can think of that word and it says, yeah, I'm going to start to shift which way I'm going, so that if there's anything else, any other negativity, it can just flow on by, but I'm going to stay grounded with this image or this thought or this feeling that's coming up that I'm able to connect with.
So, earlier I talked about displacing anxiety, and
Mm.
it seems to me that joy is a wonderful way to displace anxiety. Um, so, there's a couple of questions that have been helpful for me. And I'd like to share those questions and then ask you, and you can answer them to whatever level that you want. Um, the questions, I think these lead into wonderful ways of displacing anxiety. The first one is, what brings you life?
Mm.
What brings you joy? Um, Here's the second. When do you feel most loved? And then the third is, what encourages your soul? Or who encourages your soul?
Mm.
And so
Mhm.
I think if we can just ask those pretty simple questions and spend a few minutes and coming up with concrete answers, um, I would recommend to anybody listening that you come up with a free answer with like, I can do this in 60 seconds or 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And then another answer that's this may cost me a few dollars and I can spend an hour or two on it. And then
Mhm.
another one that may take a day or a couple of days to do. And if you can come up with answers to these life-giving, love-filling people who are encouraging your soul and you're feeling anxious, those are the things you need to go to. Then you'll know I can go to this right now. I can go to that thing later this month, or you get the idea. Landon, do you
Yeah.
mind if I ask you those questions?
If you ask
You?
me those questions,
Yes. So
uh,
what
yeah.
is it that brings you life? What's
Mm.
that brings you life?
And so thinking about like waking up in the morning and it's like, okay, here's a new day. And pretty quick, I turn to the Bible and prayer. And so like the first thing that comes to my mind is like, well, God gives me life. And when I connect with him for the first little bit of my day, then it's going to help me carry on to then how I get to show up and be with others, helping people in their struggles or connecting with people, and checking in or being checked in on, and just having that conversation. So then a part of that also makes me think of laughter.
Yeah.
And so making sure that I have some time with someone where we can have some lightheartedness and make some jokes about something that says, yeah, there may be heavy things in the world, but it's okay to laugh about life too, because there can be this joy and this lightness, and that is the first thing that comes to mind.
Yeah. The other day I was feeling stressed. And so I opened up old videos of Annie when she was a baby playing with her cousins. And it was just making me laugh. And it had a way of just dissolving whatever I was feeling before then.
Yeah.
So when do you feel most loved?
Mm. The most loved is so this gets to love languages in a way, and I'd made note to talk about that. So for me, there's quality time, which can be a challenge right now in some ways, and having to redefine what quality time can look like.
Okay.
Another thing is physical touch, which is another thing to be aware of, that physical touch is not as common as it has been in the past. And then words of affirmation. And so whenever someone can offer encouragement, whenever I'm able to offer encouragement or be present with someone, and so sometimes like the phone calls or checking in with people, like I've been able to notice when I've had these experiences over the past 2 weeks, I was like, wow, this moment with this person is really pouring into me. And it may not have been anything real like directed to me, but just like being in that presence, or having that contact over the phone,
Yeah.
something about it said like, we're in this together and it's good.
So can you talk more generally about the place of love languages and caring for ourselves and our own anxiety?
Yeah. So uh, a lot of people know about the love languages, and thinking about what yours is, it might be getting met right now, but it's probably getting met differently than it was a month ago. Because we think, well, like my spouse, my partner is meeting my love languages, and that's probably true. But we also are probably getting to spend quality time with friends or extended family and that kind of thing. And now we're not.
Yeah.
And so if we were getting our emotional needs met from love languages with our partner, but also from friends and from other people in like healthy, appropriate ways, but now they're absent, then I'm probably looking to this one other person to fulfill all these other roles that maybe some friends or other family were fitting in with quality time or affirmation or that kind of thing.
So like the burden of all the love languages is falling on a couple of particular people.
And they're going to fall short.
Yeah.
And they're noticing that absence too. And so I think being able to be aware of like, what are my love languages or my top love language? How has that been met in the recent months? How can I recognize that it's not being met now? And can I communicate that? to my spouse, to some of the people that I'm closest to. And if they're not able to fulfill it in that way, like, can I accept that and know that that's okay? Because I know for me, like with physical touch, when I go so long without it, I start to feel like emotionally withering inside. And so being able to recognize that and go, okay, if I'm feeling that way right now, is there something I can do about it? Is there someone I can ask, for this? And if not, can I then turn that over to God to say, well, God, you know me and you know my needs and you know how to comfort me. So I'm going to turn this over to you. And that has also been very helpful for me in noticing some of those things that maybe I wasn't able to get it from someone in that moment, but at least recognizing it and turning that over to God to say, this need is going unmet. And so I'm going to let you have this because I know you can handle it how it needs to be handled. And that's been helpful and comforting because then he showed up in different ways.
So, who encourages your soul?
Mm. Thankfully, I have a lot of friends from church and a lot of friends from Celebrate Recovery and uh, family. I've taken this time. I have a couple of cousins who I'll call usually every 3 to 4 months. And I've talked to both of those cousins in the last week. And just getting to talk about the serious stuff, but also laugh and cut up about the rest of life. And it's really encouraging because these are the people I've known, all my life.
I think that practice, especially right now, can be so valuable for folks with anxiety to just
Yeah.
reach out to 2 or 3 people a week, maybe 2 or 3 people a day if you're really experiencing anxiety.
Yeah.
And instead of talking about the anxiety ridden things, talk about the good old days. Like, talk about just crack up about old stories and the things that you're saying you got to experience with your cousins. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah. It was
Um,
really good for me.
so, can you talk, and we'll wrap up with this, just specific practices for managing anxiety during coronavirus, during a pandemic and quarantine?
Okay. Yeah. So I have two things that I'd like to share. And the first is going to be about some apps that you could download on your phone. Because oftentimes when I'm sitting with a client, I will guide them through a relaxation exercise, and it works well in the office, but then I don't go home with them. And so they need something else often to guide with that process because we can do it on our own, but when you're not used to it, it's really helpful to have something else. And so I have a list, and I think we'll be able to post that so people can like take a screenshot or that kind of thing. But some apps to consider are like Headspace, Breathe to relax, the virtual Hope box, which actually has multiple components to it. There's some inspirational quotes, there's some calming exercises, and then there's a section called Distract Me, and it has games like finding words or playing mahjong or other stuff like that, Sudoku. So just a little like, hey, let's get our mind away from this kind of stuff and focus on something mindless for a little while. Mood Tools, Breathe, and Super Better all have different aspects of trying to help you put things into practice to calm down. And with that, limiting your exposure. Like, we all need to be informed. We need to know what's going on and what we need to do to help the situation. But like, once we're aware of that, which takes maybe 5, 10, 15 minutes, then it's like, now let's focus on other things. In particular, I've been looking at websites that post good news stories and focus on positive things because we all need something a little bit more lighthearted and things to laugh at or things to feel good about. And so that kind of thing, I think, can go a long ways. And I came across something and then shared it on Facebook, and it was 7 daily quarantine questions. Who am I checking on or connecting with today? And so you already said check in with just a few people a day, whether that's phone call, text, and being aware that they may not get back immediately because they're busy and got other stuff going on, but check
Yeah.
in. And if you really need somebody, then you make that extra effort to reach out to say, hey, I really need to touch base with you or with someone today just to feel connected. What expectations of normal am I letting go of today? Because life doesn't look like what it used to right now. And it's probably going to get back to what it used to look like. But in the meantime, how can I accept that it doesn't look like my regular routine? And that just means I get to create a new routine today. And it doesn't have to be anything big, but just a little small something that we can do to help shift with, well, that's not going to happen today, but here's what I do get to do today. How am I getting outside today, spending time in nature? How am I moving my body today? Because it's real easy to sit on the couch and veg out. And so we need to move.
So on number 3 and 4, my family's been
Yeah.
doing both of those very often. We've been going on family walks at
Yeah.
different breaks in the day, multiple times.
Mm,
We'll just wait for a break in the rain, or we've had a couple of beautiful days. That gets your body moving and it gets you outside, and I think both of those can be a great gift. Um, so even in shelter in place from our local mayor and federal guidelines from the White House and the CDC, you can still take walks. Just when you take walks, just wave at people and talk to them from a distance. Just don't get too close. So we actually had a social distancing picnic with a family. We were in the yard, they were on the porch, but we got to kind of talk to each other. It's a way to be outside and to be with the people that are energizers. So what about number 5 on the daily
yeah.
quarantine questions?
How am I expressing my creativity today? Because some people know they're creative and they already have hobbies in place. Some people don't have hobbies in place, though, and yet we need to find something that's going to get me active. So, not necessarily watching something, but if I watch something, then what can I do to show some form of creativity, whether that's writing about it, talking about it, drawing about it, uh, maybe trying some new hobbies and realizing that I'm not good at sculpting, but I tried it, and so I'll try something different. Was an example someone
I
used.
talked to a few members today who were sewing masks for our healthcare workers. They're producing 140 masks in just a couple of days. So they're absolutely finding a creative outlet for this strange time that we're in.
That's awesome.
Yep.
Number 6, what type of self-care am I practicing today? What am I doing to make sure that I'm meeting some of my own needs physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually? And if I need assistance with that, then that kind of goes back to number 1 of who can I connect with that will help nurture me in some way, and how can I share nurturing with them? And number 7, what am I grateful for today? And that's a great spiritual practice, and there are a lot of benefits to gratitude, how it helps to shift our mind mentally, how it helps our emotions. It will decrease that wave. It invites God into that. And sometimes we have to get really basic, because sometimes when we are scared or fearful or hurting, it can feel really hard to come up with something that we're grateful for. And yet, even the most basic things uh, end up getting to where my mind is starting to shift in that right direction to then find other things to be grateful for. And you can certainly think about these things that you're grateful for, but it seems really helpful to be able to verbalize them, or to maybe verbalize them in prayer, or go ahead and write them out and keep some sort of gratitude journal. And it doesn't have to be long or extensive. And you may even say the same things every day, and that's okay too. It's just really what ends up working for you, but making sure you're taking time to see whatever blessing there is present in your life, even with the hard and heavy stuff that's around us.
I love that we ended with Thanksgiving. I think this is one of the central habits to walking through and with anxiety. Um, just being grateful, gracious people. Landon, let's wrap it up there, but I want to say thank you to you. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. I'm so proud of the man that you are and the kind of transformation that you've been living in just really the last 5 years that I've really gotten to know you. Thank you for all of that and for your time today.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for that affirmation.
You got it.